The parking garage under Weston Capitol smelled like concrete and cold air, and the particular silence of a building not yet awake. Callum Mercer arrived 40 minutes before anyone else on most mornings, not because the work demanded it, but because the apartment felt different after Leo left for school, a specific kind of quiet that had nothing to do with peace. He had learned in the 4 years since Emma died that there were two kinds of silence, the kind that rested and the kind that waited. Their apartment on mornings when Leo was gone was the second kind. He was crossing the third level of the garage toward the elevator when he heard the sound of a cardboard box losing the argument with gravity. The young analyst from the 7th floor, the one who had started 3 weeks ago and still wore his ID badge on the outside of his jacket, was crouched on the concrete trying to gather a cascade of binders that had slid from an overloaded box. The elevator doors were closing. Nobody else was on the level. Callum set down his bag without thinking about it. He gathered the binders from the floor while the analyst held the box open, and neither of them said anything until the last binder was stacked and the box was balanced again. Callum picked up his bag. The analyst started to say something that sounded like gratitude, and Callum was already walking toward the elevator, pressing the button for 7, watching the numbers climb. He did not think of it as kindness. He thought of it the way he thought of holding a door or letting someone merge in traffic, the basic maintenance of a world that required people to occasionally notice each other. Emma had called it his superpower once early in their marriage, watching him help a stranger change a tire in the rain. He had told her it wasn't a superpower, it was just paying attention. She had kissed him on the cheek and said those were the same thing. He had not thought about that memory in months. He filed it away before the elevator reached 7. The floor was empty at that hour except for the hum of the HVAC system and the blue glow of monitors in sleep mode. Callum sat at his desk and pulled up the quarterly variance reports he had been working on since Tuesday and tried to make the numbers mean something. They did technically. He was good at this, better than good if the performance reviews Garrett Holloway had been filing on his behalf for 4 years were accurate. He saw patterns in financial data, the way some people heard melody and noise, and the work had been for a long time the one place where his brain went quiet and just functioned. This morning the numbers blurred. He knew why. He had known since he woke up before the alarm, lying in the gray pre-dawn dark with his hand on Emma's side of the bed without meaning to put it there. The date had a weight to it that did not diminish with repetition. 4 years was supposed to mean something, supposed to represent a transition from acute to manageable, from crisis to chronicle. He had read enough about grief in the first year to know the clinical language of it. What the clinical language did not cover was the way certain mornings simply refused to be ordinary, regardless of how much he needed them to be. He checked the time on his phone, not to see if he had messages, to see how many hours remained until he could pick up Leo, which was the fixed point his days organized themselves around whether he intended it or not. Owen Webb appeared at 7:43, which was early for Owen, who had the metabolism of someone half his age and operated on the theory that arriving before 8 required a compelling reason. He dropped into the chair across from Callum's desk without invitation, a habit Callum had stopped trying to break because Owen's social architecture did not include the concept of unwelcome arrival. He processed the world as a series of conversations waiting to happen and had simply decided sometime in his first month at Weston Capitol that Callum was one of the more interesting ones. "You've got the face," Owen said, opening his coffee. Callum did not look up from the monitor. "I have a face. I've had it my whole life." "The specific face. The one that means you're here but you're not here." "I'm reviewing the Martinez variance." "The Martinez variance has been done since Tuesday. You told me that yourself." Owen tilted his head. "What's today?" The question landed with more precision than Owen probably intended. Callum clicked through to a different file. Owen, to his credit, read the silence correctly and did not ask the follow-up. The morning meeting was at 9, and Callum spent the intervening hour building a wall of work around himself that was mostly functional. He responded to 3 emails from the West Coast team. He drafted 2 sections of the Henderson analysis that weren't due until Friday. He did not think about Emma or the date or the specific intersection of 2 streets in this city that he had not driven through in 4 years and would not drive through today. He took the long way to work every morning. Had done so since the week after the funeral, when he had gotten behind the wheel for the first time with Leo in the back seat and found himself physically unable to make the turn onto Alderton Street. Leo had not understood, had been occupied with a toy dinosaur and unaware that his father was gripping the steering wheel hard enough to leave marks in his palms. Callum had gone around. He had been going around ever since. Owen knew. Not why that particular piece of information lived in a room inside Callum that had for 4 years held exactly 2 visitors, himself and Garrett Holloway. But Owen had noticed the route discrepancy early on, had done the math on Callum's commute time, and had arrived at the conclusion that something on Alderton Street was off limits. He had never asked. That restraint was the reason Callum tolerated the uninvited arrivals at his desk. The 9 o'clock meeting was in the second-floor conference room with the windows that looked out over the parking structure. Claire Weston ran it as she ran most things on the operational side of Weston Capital, with the kind of precision that read as effortless from a distance, and was, Callum suspected, the product of extraordinary effort made invisible. She had been doing this for 11 years since her father had handed her a division, and the clear expectation that nepotism would only carry you so far and competence would need to do the rest. From what Callum had observed in 4 years, competence had done considerably more than the rest. He sat where he always sat, which was to say as far from her as the table's geometry allowed without making it obvious. This required a calibrated kind of spatial awareness that he had developed over the past 8 weeks, the period during which he had been operating on the principle that proximity to Claire Weston was a resource to be conserved rather than spent. He was good at it. The avoidance was architectural. He scheduled calls during windows when she moved through the analyst floor, arranged his bathroom breaks to coincide with her elevator arrivals, found urgent reasons to be on 6 when meetings on 7 were likely to leave him alone with her in the corridor. None of this was something he had consciously planned. It had emerged organically from the same instinct that made him take the long way on Alderton Street, the recognition that some things approached directly would cost him something he could not afford to lose. The problem with the meeting was the moment near the end when Garrett said something genuinely terrible about the third-quarter projections, a joke so blunt in its wrongness that it should not have been funny, a comparison between their forecast accuracy and a dartboard operated by someone who had never seen a dart. The room gave the polite laugh of people who respected their CFO too much to let the silence stretch. And Claire, who was looking at her laptop when Garrett delivered the line, looked up with a half-second delay and laughed for real. Callum heard it and felt it move through him like light through something clear. He looked at his own laptop before his face could arrange itself into anything informative. The laugh was not remarkable on its own. She had a sense of humor that was dry and quick, well matched to Garrett's particular sensibility, and moments like this were not unusual in meetings she ran. What was remarkable was Callum's internal response to it, which he had been cataloging and suppressing for 8 weeks with diminishing success. The way the sound stayed with him for the rest of the meeting, the way he found himself waiting without meaning to for the next one. He left the conference room 3 steps behind Garrett, which put him in the hallway before the rest of the group, which was the plan. What was not the plan was Claire's voice from just behind him. "Can you stay for a minute?" The hallway emptied with what felt like deliberate theatrical efficiency. Owen threw him a look that contained more information than most people conveyed in full sentences. Garrett paused briefly in the doorway, a pause that held a certain quality of knowing, then continued toward the elevators. They were alone in the glass-walled conference room, in a building that was entirely awake and operational on the other side of the glass. Claire stood at the head of the table, one hand resting on the back of her chair, and what Callum noticed was not her expression, but the effort behind it, the way she was holding herself carefully, with a degree of precision that matched his own. They were both, he realized, people who had become very skilled at not showing what they were managing. "I owe you a question." Her voice was direct without being hard. "And you don't have to answer it. But I'm going to ask it anyway because I'm tired of pretending I haven't noticed." She waited a beat. "Why do you avoid me?" The thing about a precise question is that it forecloses evasion. Callum could have said he didn't know what she meant. He could have redirected to the Martinez variance or the Henderson analysis or any of the 6 things genuinely on his plate. He was skilled at redirection. He had been practicing it for 8 weeks specifically to avoid this moment. Instead, he heard himself say, "Yes." Claire's expression shifted in a way he couldn't quite classify. Something between surprise and relief, the particular look of a person who has been second-guessing their own perception and is now, for better or worse, confirmed. "At least you're honest." "I try to be." "You try to be honest, but you also schedule your meetings to end precisely when mine begin." There was no accusation in it. It was just accurate. "You take phone calls the moment I enter a room. Last Thursday you found urgent business on 6 when I was heading to the executive suite. I counted." Callum's jaw tightened. "I wasn't aware my schedule required external monitoring." "It doesn't. But it does require an explanation when one of my best analysts starts treating our work environment like a problem to be engineered around." She took a step closer. "What did I do?" The question was genuine. That was the part that was hardest to navigate. Not anger, not professional confrontation, but genuine confusion from a woman trying to understand what she had done wrong. He wanted to tell her she had done nothing. He wanted to tell her the problem was entirely structural, entirely his, entirely located in the gap between who he had been 4 years ago and who he had become since. He wanted to tell her that her laugh in a conference room could undo 8 weeks of careful distance in approximately 3 seconds, and that this terrified him in a way he had not been terrified since the hospital. "You didn't do anything." He moved toward the door. "Then what is it?" His hand found the door handle. He stood there with his back to her and let himself for one unguarded second feel the full weight of what he was carrying. The date that today was the street he could not drive down, the photograph of Emma on his desk that his son still kissed goodnight, and the fact that somewhere in the past 8 weeks, looking forward to Monday mornings had become quietly and without his permission a thing that happened. "It's not professional," he said, and left. The afternoon was meetings and analysis and the mechanical forward motion of a workday that asked nothing of him emotionally, which was exactly what he needed. He moved through it with practiced efficiency and told himself the conversation in the conference room had accomplished exactly what avoidance had been designed to prevent, and that what was required now was redoubling, not retreating. He picked Leo up at 5:45 from the Jefferson Street Learning Center, which was painted the specific shade of yellow that indicated institutional optimism, and Leo came through the doors at a velocity that suggested he had been storing energy since lunch. "Dad, if a shark and a T-Rex were in a fight in the ocean, who wins?" Leo was buckled into the back seat before Callum had fully processed the question, his Spider-Man backpack occupying the seat beside him with the authority of a second passenger. "The shark. It's underwater. The T-Rex would drown immediately." "But what if the T-Rex was standing on the bottom?" "T-Rexes couldn't breathe underwater, buddy." "What if it was a special T-Rex that could breathe underwater?" Callum glanced in the rearview mirror at his son's face, which was entirely serious in the way that only 6-year-olds could be entirely serious about the combat logistics of extinct creatures. Something loosened in his chest that had been tightened since morning. Then it would be an extremely unfair fight and the T-Rex would probably win. Leo considered this with the gravity of a federal judge. "I think they'd be friends." Yeah, because they're both the biggest in their thing. They'd understand each other." Callum drove, taking the long way without registering the decision, and listened to his son develop an elaborate theory about apex predator solidarity that was probably the most original thing he had heard all week. Their apartment was on the 4th floor of a building on Westmore Avenue that was solid and unremarkable in the way that buildings chosen for their school district tended to be. Callum had picked it 2 years after Emma died, when he had finally accepted that staying in the house they had chosen together was costing Leo more than the stability it was supposed to provide. The apartment had good light in Leo's room and a park within walking distance, and no particular memories attached to any of its walls. On the mantel in the living room there was a single framed photograph, Emma at 29, holding newborn Leo, her smile wide and exhausted and entirely hers. Leo kissed it goodnight on most evenings, a ritual he had started himself around age 4 and continued with the matter-of-fact consistency of someone who had organized his understanding of the world to include a mother he could not remember clearly but wanted to honor anyway. Callum had never suggested the ritual. He had never discouraged it. He stood in the doorway sometimes and watched his son press his small fingers to the glass and felt something so complex it had no single name. After dinner, pasta Leo's construction, Callum's minimal contribution, and after the dishes and the bath and the negotiation about which book and for how many minutes Leo was in bed with the door cracked at the specific angle that allowed the hallway light to fall across the floor the way he liked it. Callum was washing the last pan when Leo's voice came from the bedroom. "Dad?" "Yeah, buddy." A pause, the kind Leo took when he was working out whether to say the thing he was thinking. "If you could go back and change one thing, would you?" Callum's hands stopped moving in the water. The question existed in multiple registers simultaneously. It was a 6-year-old's version of a philosophical inquiry, the kind Leo produced with some regularity because he had inherited by some genetic or environmental mechanism the tendency to ask the largest available question in the simplest available form. It was also in its particular timing on this particular date a question that landed somewhere much more specific than Leo knew. Callum stood at the kitchen sink with the water running and said nothing for long enough that he heard Leo shift in his bed. "I'm thinking," Callum said. Another pause. Then Leo's voice again, entirely unbothered, already moving on. "Okay. Also, can we get a fish?" "We'll talk about it this weekend." "That means no." "It means we'll talk about it this weekend." He heard Leo settle into his pillow with the sigh of a person who had learned to read the subtext of parental temporizing. Within 6 minutes, confirmed by the specific sound of his son's breathing that Callum had been monitoring since the NICU, Leo was asleep. Callum dried his hands and stood in the kitchen and did not move for a while. The question he had not answered was not really about regret. He knew that. Leo had not asked it with the weight Callum had loaded onto it, had asked it the way children ask everything, with genuine curiosity and no particular investment in the answer. But questions had the weight you gave them, not the weight they arrived with. And the weight Callum had given this one was 4 years old and had never been put down. He had been driving. This was the fact that lived in the sealed room. Emma in the passenger seat at 32 weeks, because they had decided that the risk of flying was not worth it for a conference that was technically optional, and the long drive through the November dark was supposed to be romantic, in the way that road trips were supposed to be romantic, and he had been the one behind the wheel when the truck came through the light. He had not run the light. He had not been distracted. He had done nothing wrong according to every official report, every eyewitness account, every reconstruction of the accident that the insurance company had generated. He had been driving a car that was hit by a truck whose driver had run a red light, and his wife and his unborn daughter had died from injuries sustained in that impact, and his son had been delivered by emergency C-section and had lived, and Callum had walked away with a broken arm and 3 cracked ribs, and a grief so total it had reorganized every cell of who he had been into someone new. The official account said he had done nothing wrong. The room inside him said something different. He poured a glass of water he didn't want and sat at the kitchen table and looked at Emma's photograph from across the apartment and thought about the 9 o'clock meeting and Claire Weston's laugh and the 8 weeks of careful architecture he had constructed to manage the fact of her and the degree to which it was. He was beginning to understand failing. He took out his phone, opened a new email, typed "Fresh slate Monday morning," deleted the whole thing, typed it again, deleted it again. The third time he wrote, "Can we start over Monday? Fresh slate." He looked at it for a long time. Then he sent it before the part of his brain that had been running the avoidance protocol could file an objection. He set the phone face down on the table. He looked at Emma's photograph and felt the specific guilt of a man doing something he did not have permission to do from a person who could no longer give it. The phone screen lit up. He turned it over. Her reply had come in 3 minutes. "Fresh slate. See you Monday." 2 words. He read them twice. The feeling they produced was not what he expected. Not relief exactly, not the particular warm drop of tension that came with a problem resolved. It was something more complicated and more honest. The feeling of a door that had been closed for a very long time swinging open, just slightly enough to let in air and the simultaneous awareness that doors that opened could not always be closed again. He was still looking at the phone when it buzzed a second time. Unknown number. He opened the message. The photograph was taken from outside through glass, the sightline consistent with someone standing on the street level, facing the lobby windows. It showed two figures in the frame. Callum on the left, Claire on the right, standing in the main lobby after a presentation 2 weeks ago when they had both been heading to the parking structure at the same time and had walked together for approximately 4 minutes discussing the Henderson Quarterly. In the photograph, they were not touching. They were not even close by any objective measure. But the angle had caught something in the quality of the space between them, the slight angle of his body toward hers, the way she was looking up at him mid-sentence, that told a story the photographer had clearly intended to tell. Below the image, one line I've been watching. Don't. No signature, no additional text. Callum read it 3 times. Then he set the phone down very carefully on the kitchen table, the way you set something down when you need to think before you touch it again, and looked at the locked screen for a long time without moving. In the bedroom down the hall, Leo's breathing was slow and even, the sound of a child who had found the question he needed to ask and asked it and moved on into sleep without needing the answer. The apartment held its specific silence around Callum, the second kind, the kind that waited. He picked up his phone and forwarded the photograph to his personal email and then deleted the message thread and then sat in the kitchen with the question of who had taken it and why and how long they had been doing so, and the fresher and more complicated question of what he had just agreed to with 2 words sent to a woman whose laugh had been defeating 8 weeks of careful engineering all morning. The clock on the microwave read 9:47. He would need to be up at 6. Leo had a school project due Thursday involving a diagram of the water cycle and had very strong opinions about where the cloud should go, and this required a certain quality of paternal engagement that functioned best on adequate sleep. He knew all of this. He also knew he was not going to sleep soon. He looked at Emma's photograph across the room. In the kitchen light, she looked the same as she always did, caught in that moment of joy that the camera had found and fixed, unaware of everything that would come after. The photograph on his phone, the one now living in his email, showed 2 people standing in a lobby with something invisible and unnamed occupying the space between them, and someone had seen it and felt the need to say, "Don't." Callum sat in the kitchen with both images somewhere in his mind and felt with a clarity that surprised him that he was standing at the edge of something that he had been walking slowly toward for 8 weeks without admitting the direction of travel, and that the message from the unknown number was not a threat so much as a confirmation that something visible was happening whether he had named it or not, and that what he did next would require more honesty than he had been practicing. He was not ready. He had not been ready for 4 years and was not ready now and might not be ready for a considerable time. But Leo had asked the question, would you go back and change one thing? And the answer that lived in the sealed room was, yes, obviously yes. He would go back and not drive that night. He would have taken the flight or delayed the trip or found any of the 1,000 other configurations that did not end with Emma and Lily in the dark. But underneath that answer, if he went far enough down, was a different question. Whether going back to change the thing meant going back to where he was before it happened, which was a version of himself who had been happy in a way he could barely remember, who had woken up next to someone and felt the specific weight of a future being built in real time, who had not yet learned that the world could take everything in a single intersection. He could not go back. He knew that. The question was whether forward was still a direction available to him and whether he deserved to find out. He went to bed. He did not sleep for a long time. When he did not dream about the accident, which was its own small mercy. He dreamed about a long road and a turn he had not yet decided whether to take, and when the alarm went off at 6, he was already awake, lying on his back in the gray early light with his hand on the empty side of the bed, and the knowledge that Monday was 2 days away and that he had made a small promise he could not quite explain but could not in good conscience take back. He sent the transfer request to Garrett from the parking structure before going upstairs. Clean and operational requesting movement to the Strategic Planning Division, citing professional development and alignment with restructuring priorities, framing it as forward-looking rather than reactive. He attached a brief note. The timing is intentional. I'll explain when you have a moment. Garrett's response arrived while Callum was in the elevator. I had a feeling. I'll handle the Margaret piece. Come see me after the 9 o'clock. You did the right thing. He took the long way. He registered making the choice which was different from the automatic pilot of previous mornings. The distinction was small and significant simultaneously. The shoe crisis happened before any of that. Leo had stood in the kitchen doorway at 6:42 in one shoe, his expression carrying the particular indignation of a child who had placed something in a location and found the universe had not honored the arrangement. The search lasted 6 minutes and covered 4 rooms, and ended at the radiator in a way that raised questions about spatial mechanics neither of them had time to pursue. Callum had driven Leo to Jefferson Street listening to an elaborate theory about objects migrating to warmer locations during cold weather, which was scientifically imprecise but structurally sound for a 6-year-old, and had dropped him off with the efficiency of a man who had been running a 2-person household long enough to have optimized every handoff. He sat in the school parking lot for 90 seconds after Leo disappeared through the doors. Then he drove to Weston Capital and did not think about the fresh slate he had offered and the woman who had accepted it in 3 minutes, which meant she had been waiting for the message in some form and had not needed time to decide. Owen was already at his desk, which was unusual enough to register. He had brought coffee for both of them, which was unusual enough to be alarming. "You're early," Callum said. "I had thoughts." Owen handed him the second cup with the expression of someone who had organized their concerns into a delivery order. "Several of them are yours. Start with the ones that aren't. Those are less interesting." Owen settled on the edge of the desk with the familiarity of someone who had stopped asking permission for that particular perch months ago. "Henderson reprojection is clean. Martinez variance confirmed. Mine and handled." He paused the way he paused when the actual point was still coming. "The interesting ones involve the fact that you walked in here Friday looking like a man who had made a decision, and you're walking in today looking like a man who has accepted the consequences of it. Those are yours." Callum drank the coffee. It was better than what he would have made himself, which Owen knew and deployed strategically. "I emailed her Friday night." "I know. She mentioned it to Patricia on 5, who mentioned it to me." Owen did not look apologetic about this information chain. "Not the contents, just that you'd reached out. The word she used was refreshing." "That's a low bar." "You'd been engineering your schedule around the woman for 8 weeks. Refreshing seems accurate." Owen studied him with the attentiveness he usually reserved for situations he had decided were worth paying attention to. "You okay?" The question could have been deflected. Callum had been deflecting that question for 4 years with a fluency that bordered on reflex. But Owen had come in early with coffee, which meant he had decided to be useful on purpose, and Callum was tired enough of the weight of carrying things silently that he said, "I don't know what I'm doing." Owen received this without surprise, which was its own kind of gift. "That's the most honest thing you've said to me since I started here. I'd call that meaningful progress." The 9 o'clock did not have Claire in it. This was a structural mercy that allowed Callum to spend the first 2 hours of the day doing actual work without the ambient disruption of her presence in a room. He reviewed the Anderson account files, drafted the summary analysis Garrett had requested for the board presentation, and moved through 4 accumulated emails with the focused efficiency his colleagues associated with him. The same energy that had been for years, the thing he used to hold everything else at a careful distance. At 11:14, Garrett called. Not email, not a corridor stop, a direct call which carried its own register. Garrett's voice had the quality Callum had learned to identify over 4 years, the particular tone of a man with something to say who was deciding how to say it. "You have time this afternoon." Garrett's voice was even. "Not here. There's a place on Clement Birchwood Coffee. Low traffic. 4 o'clock work. What's this about?" "You. A conversation I should have had 6 weeks ago." A beat. 4 o'clock. It worked. Callum spent the intervening time thinking about what 6 weeks ago had looked like from Garrett's vantage point. Garrett, who had hired him into Weston Capital when Callum had arrived, carrying grief so total it had been visible in how he moved through a room. Garrett, who had lost his own wife to cancer a decade prior, and had never once used that fact as a credential or a lever, but had simply been available in the specific way of someone who understood the particular architecture of surviving the unsurvivable. Claire passed his cubicle at 2:40, moving between obligations, not stopping. She glanced in his direction as she passed a brief, level acknowledgement that was not loaded with anything dramatic. Just confirmation the fresh slate was in effect and she intended to honor it. He looked back. 2 seconds. Then she was past and he was looking at his monitor and his pulse was doing something he chose not to examine. Owen, from 3 desks over, returned to his own screen with the studied neutrality of a man heroically minding his own business. Birchwood on Clement Street was exactly as Garrett had described. Good coffee, low light, the kind of narrow establishment that had survived its neighborhood's successive transformations by refusing to update anything about its aesthetic since the mid-90s. Garrett was already in the back booth, 2 cups on the table, looking tired in the way that registered as stress rather than age. His tie was loosened in a way Callum had not seen in 4 years of working together. "How long have I known you?" Garrett wrapped both hands around his cup. Callum settled into the booth across from him. 4 years. 4 years. You want to know what I've learned in that time? You're going to tell me regardless. You're exceptional with numbers. You see structures in financial data that trained analysts miss. You work harder than anyone I've mentored across 3 firms in 25 years. Garrett looked at him steadily. You're also the most efficiently defended person I have ever met, and I've spent 15 years in corporate finance, so that field is not small. If this is about my performance review, it's not about your performance. Garrett's voice was even, but not gentle, the voice of a man who had prepared the thing he needed to say and was going to say it. It's about what you're going to lose if someone doesn't put the thing out loud before you make it permanent. He set down his cup. The night Emma died, you were driving. He did not phrase it as a question. The booth went quiet in a specific way. The espresso machine at the front of the shop produced its usual mechanical complaint. 2 people near the window laughed at something. Callum sat with the sealed room suddenly cracked open by a statement that had not been made to him in 4 years because nobody had known to make it. He had not answered. But the not answering arrived in the space between them as its own answer, and Garrett received it without surprise. I thought so. Something shifted in Garrett's voice, not softer exactly, but less armored, the register of a man who had sat in a similar booth in a different city a decade ago. I lost Carol 11 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 7 months from diagnosis to the end, which was fast enough that we couldn't fully prepare and slow enough that we had time to watch it happen. He paused. For 3 years after I told myself I was grieving, I went to work. I kept the house. I did the things you did. What I was actually doing was punishing myself for the audacity of being the one who stayed. He held Callum's gaze. She never asked me to do that. She would have been furious at me for it. Emma didn't blame me. The words came out automatic, the thing Callum had said to himself so many times it had the worn texture of a line rehearsed in the dark. Every investigation was clear. The driver ran the light. I had the right of way. There is no version of that night in which I did anything wrong. I know that, Garrett said. The part of your brain that processes facts knows that too. But you were behind the wheel, and Emma died. And somewhere underneath the part of you that processes facts, that equation has been running without correction for 4 years because you have never said it out loud to another person. He let that land before continuing. The facts don't fix the equation. Only saying it does. The silence that followed was not comfortable. It was the silence of something true taking up space it had been denied. Callum looked at his untouched coffee. He thought about Leo at the kitchen sink 2 nights ago asking whether he would go back and change one thing, and the way the question had found the exact center of something he had never let himself look at directly. He thought about the sealed room and the one fact inside it, not that Emma had died, but that he had been driving, and the way those 4 years had been organized around keeping that room sealed because opening it would require him to do something he did not know how to do. I don't know how to want something for myself again. The confession arrived without his full cooperation the way honest things sometimes did when the conditions for them had been building long enough. Every time I feel anything that moves toward the future, it feels like I'm redistributing something that should stay where it is. With Emma. With what was supposed to happen. He corrected it carefully. We had a specific future. I can still map it where we would have been by now, what Leo's life would look like with both of us in it. Moving towards something else feels like erasing the map. Garrett was quiet for a moment. Outside Clement Street moved through its late afternoon at the pace of a neighborhood not in a hurry. The map isn't real anymore, he said finally. It was real and it mattered, and it is completely gone. And the question you've been refusing to ask yourself is whether there's a different map, not one that replaces the first one, but one that exists alongside it in the same geography. Both true simultaneously. He looked at Callum with the directness of someone who had navigated the same terrain from a different starting point. She didn't blame you. I would stake everything I own on that. The only question is whether you're willing to stop blaming yourself long enough to find out what's still possible. Callum drove back to Weston Capital to retrieve his laptop. He went upstairs, collected it, past Claire's office with the door open and her at her desk focused on something on her screen. He felt the specific pull of something unnamed and not yet allowed, and he walked past it and he went down to his car. At the intersection of Alderton and Connell, he stopped at the red light. Not because he was taking the long way, because the direct route home ran through this intersection, and he had been taking the long way to avoid it. And today, after 40 minutes with Garrett Holloway, he had driven the direct route without realizing it until he was already here. The light turned green. He sat for 2 seconds longer than he needed to. Then he turned left onto Birch instead of going straight, adding the 47 seconds he always added, and drove home the long way. He was not ready. Garrett had cracked the door. The door was not yet open. But for the first time in 4 years, he had driven to the intersection on purpose rather than by accident. He had seen the green light. He had registered what it meant to make the choice. That was different. Not enough, but different. Tuesday and Wednesday passed in the accumulated texture of a week that knew something was coming. Leo had his water cycle project due Thursday, which required 2 evenings of negotiation about the precise location of the cloud formation and resulted in a diagram that Callum considered objectively the finest first-grade meteorological illustration he had encountered, which was a sample of one, but still. Owen moved through the office with the alert quietness of someone paying careful attention to a situation while performing the appearance of not doing so, which was the highest form of restraint Owen was capable of and which Callum noticed without comment. Wednesday evening, after Leo was asleep, Callum stood in front of the open closet for the second time that week. Emma's clothes on the right side unchanged for 4 years. He stood there for a long time. He did not take anything down. He also did not close the door immediately the way he usually did. He stood in the doorway looking at the clothes and let himself look at them without flinching, which was smaller than clearing the closet and larger than anything he had managed in the previous 4 years. Then he went to his desk, opened his laptop, and found an email in his drafts folder. He had written it at 2 a.m. 6 weeks ago and never sent it a message to the director of operations at Weston Capital, 3 sentences long, professional and entirely honest, that said he had developed feelings that were affecting his professional judgment and that he wanted to address the situation directly rather than let it become something neither of them had managed. He had not sent it because sending it had felt like stepping off a ledge with no knowledge of what was below. He read it now. He did not send it, but he did not delete it either. He closed the laptop and went to bed and slept better than he had in 2 weeks. Thursday morning arrived at 7:52 with Owen Webb at Callum's desk, no coffee in hand, which was a different kind of signal. Owen had coffee for himself. The distinction was intentional. He sat down and was choosing his words with more care than usual. Marcus Holt has been asking questions. Owen's voice was even. I need you to hear this without reacting immediately. The name registered with specific unpleasantness. Marcus Holt was Claire's ex-husband, documented in the company's conflict of interest registry as required when former spouses worked in the same organization. He handled corporate contracts and compliance on 3, and in the 2 years since the divorce had maintained the kind of professional surface that concealed from what Callum had gathered without seeking a sustained and particular bitterness. What kind of questions? About you. About Claire. About the distribution of your project assignments over the past 8 months, and whether the pattern reflects merit or something else. Owen kept his voice level. He talked to Patricia in accounting about your performance reviews. He asked Dwight in analytics whether he'd noticed changes in project allocation since you joined. This has been happening for at least 2 weeks, probably more. A pause. He's building something. Callum set down his pen. The unknown number photograph from Friday reconfigured in his understanding, same source, different medium. Marcus Holt had stood outside the building after hours with a camera. Marcus Holt had sent the photograph with a one-line warning. Marcus Holt had been conducting what amounted to a systematic investigation of his ex-wife and a man he had decided represented a specific kind of threat. What does he have? Right now, probably nothing that stands on its own. Circumstantial pattern analysis photographs a reconstruction of your meeting history. But circumstantial becomes something different when it arrives at HR or at Margaret Ellison with enough volume behind it. Owen looked at him directly. The story writes itself if you let someone else be the one writing it. Does Claire know? I don't know what Claire knows. Owen paused then, and something in his expression shifted, a brief recalibration, the look of a man deciding how much to include in what he was saying. I should tell you something else. I was near the supply closet on the executive floor last Tuesday when I saw Marcus go in after Claire. I had a feeling about it. He reached into his jacket pocket and placed his phone face down on the desk between them. I recorded it, not the whole conversation, the last 4 minutes. Enough. Callum looked at the phone. Does she know you have that? Not yet. Owen's voice was careful. I wanted to tell you first because you're the one who needs to decide how it gets used. It's not mine to deploy unilaterally. He left the phone on the desk. But it exists, and it shows him blocking her exit and making specific threats about both of your positions. The morning meeting was at 9, and Claire ran it with the competence she brought to everything she ran, and Callum sat through it with the knowledge he was carrying sitting in his chest, like something with weight and temperature. She moved through the agenda without looking at him with anything other than the professional acknowledgement of a director addressing a senior analyst whose work she respected. Whatever she was managing it with the same discipline his own avoidance had required of him for 8 weeks. The skill of someone who had learned to hold complicated things without letting them show in the set of their face. He stayed when the room cleared. She looked at him across the table. You look like you know something. Owen told me this morning. Marcus Holt has been building a file, your project assignments to me, performance reviews, meeting patterns. He kept his voice low. He sent me a photograph Friday. 2 of us in the lobby taken from outside through the glass. The message below it was one line. He's been doing this for at least 2 weeks. The expression that crossed Claire's face was not surprise. It was the look of a person receiving confirmation of something they had been hoping would turn out to be paranoia. She pulled out her chair and sat, not performing composure, just needing a surface under her. She pressed 2 fingers to her forehead briefly. He's been accessing my calendar, she said. I noticed the log anomaly 10 days ago and asked IT to look into it. They confirmed unauthorized access but couldn't attribute it at that point. Her voice was controlled in the way it was when she was holding something heavier than usual. I didn't report it formally because without a clear source, it would look like I was weaponizing company resources against a personal situation. He cornered you in the supply closet last Tuesday. It was not a question. She looked at him. How do you know that? Owen was nearby. He recorded part of it. Callum held her gaze. You should know that exists before anything else happens with it. Something moved through Claire's expression. Not gratitude exactly, but the specific shift of a person who has been managing something alone for longer than they should have and has just understood they don't have to. She was quiet for a moment, reorganizing whatever she had been carrying in isolation against the new shape of the situation. He's been doing this since the divorce wasn't clean enough for him, she said finally. not constantly in cycles. When something changes in his life or when he perceives something changing in mine, he's very careful about staying on the correct side of what's formally actionable. A pause. He's been accessing my calendar because he needs to predict where I'll be. He's not trying to prove something happened between us, Callum said slowly, working it through the same way he worked through financial structures, finding the underlying logic rather than the surface presentation. He's trying to make it impossible to credibly claim nothing happened. You don't need proof for that. You just need volume and proximity and enough pattern to let people's imaginations do the rest. Claire looked at him with an expression that shifted something in his understanding of her. You understand exactly how he thinks. I understand how you construct an argument against a financial report you can't directly refute. You don't challenge the numbers, you question the methodology until the numbers stop mattering. He held her gaze. The question is what we do before he files anything formally. They talked for 31 minutes. By the end of it, there was no plan. The situation was too dynamic for a plan, but there was a shared understanding of the territory and a mutual commitment to not surrendering the narrative to someone who had been building it in bad faith for weeks. Claire would speak to IT, formally generating documentation of the calendar access with a time-stamped record. Owen's recording would be held in reserve, not deployed yet, used only if the situation required evidence of harassment rather than speculation. They would not take actions that read as evasive or reactive because evasive and reactive were behaviors that confirmed the story Marcus was constructing. The fresh slate, Claire said near the end. That's still real. It is. But it just got more complicated. Most things worth having are. He heard the words come out of his mouth and recognized something in them, a conviction he had not accessed in 4 years. The belief that difficulty was a property of things that mattered rather than a signal to withdraw. 4 years of believing the opposite had made the recognition feel strange in his chest, like a muscle remembering how to do something after long disuse. She looked at him with the careful honesty of someone who had also been out of practice with certain things. I need to say something plainly. I've been careful about everything for 3 years. Careful about what I let myself notice, careful about what I let myself believe, careful about trusting what I thought I was reading in a person. Her voice was measured and not performing anything. After Marcus, I spent 2 years believing my judgment was broken. That I hadn't seen it coming meant I couldn't trust what I thought I knew about people. A pause. When I started noticing you, not your work, the work is straightforward. I told myself it was projection, that I was reading something into a person who was simply being professional, and that believing otherwise was my judgment failing in exactly the pattern I'd been warned about. She met his eyes. It wasn't projection. I've been navigating this badly, Callum said. You've been navigating it honestly. Something in her voice made the distinction feel like it mattered. Those aren't the same thing. He left before either of them could say something that would require an immediate answer, and spent the rest of the afternoon on work that asked nothing of him emotionally, which was what the rest of the afternoon required. At 4:37, his phone buzzed. Leo's school, not the standard afternoon alert. The direct line from the front office. His blood did the specific thing it did whenever an unexpected call came from anywhere that contained Leo. Ms. Aldrich's voice was calm and careful. Mr. Mercer. Leo is fine. Nothing is wrong, but something happened this afternoon that we thought you should know before pickup. During free draw period, Leo had drawn a picture of a family. 4 figures, a tall one, a small one, a woman with dark hair, and a figure Leo had described to his teacher as the baby that's in heaven. A classmate had said something about the drawing, had pointed out with the blunt accuracy of a 7-year-old that Leo's family had a dead person in it. Leo had not cried, had not reacted with anything that required intervention. He had looked at the classmate for a long moment and said with complete composure, "She's still in the picture." Ms. Aldrich found this worth a call. She thought Mr. Mercer should know that Leo had a clarity about his family and all its configurations that was in her experience unusual for a child his age, and spoke to a very stable foundation. Callum sat in the Weston Capitol parking structure after the call ended and did not move for several minutes. "She's still in the picture," 6 years old, defending a crayon drawing against a classmate's casual certainty about how grief worked. Not performing resilience, not doing something he'd been taught, just stating what was true from inside the world he'd built around the fact of his mother's absence. The drawing was in his backpack right now, heading toward the apartment in 40 minutes, and Callum was going to have to look at it and not come apart. He drove to Jefferson Street. Leo came through the doors at his usual velocity, backpack airborne, and climbed into the back seat with the particular expression of a child who has had a complicated day and has decided to approach it sideways. Can sharks get hiccups? Leo buckled himself with the focus of someone redirecting a conversation before it started. I genuinely don't know. I think they probably can. Hiccups are just muscles doing something by accident. Sharks have muscles. Leo looked out the window with the satisfaction of someone who had resolved a philosophical inquiry. I drew a picture at school today. Callum kept his eyes on the road. Ms. Aldrich called me. She called you. She wanted me to know about what happened with Noah. A pause. Outside, the city moved past in its afternoon indifference. Noah said dead people aren't in families anymore. I told him that's not how it works. Leo's voice was matter-of-fact, the tone of someone clarifying a basic error rather than defending a position. Is that right, Dad? That she's still in the picture? He made the turn onto Westmore Avenue. He thought about a booth at Birchwood and a map that was gone and the question of whether a different map could exist in the same geography. He thought about a woman in a glass-walled conference room saying it wasn't projection, and a man who had stood at an intersection today and seen the green light and turned away from it, and the fact that turning away today did not mean turning away forever, it meant he had seen it, which was something new. Yeah, buddy. His voice came out with a roughness he didn't fully manage. She's still in the picture. Leo seemed satisfied with the answer in the way that children were satisfied when they had already known the answer and were checking it against the adult's version. He spent the rest of the drive explaining the involuntary muscle response theory as it applied to various apex predators, and Callum drove home through the long way. And the long way was still the long way, and that was still true. That night, after Leo was asleep with the hallway light at the correct angle, Callum stood in the kitchen and looked at the drawing Leo had placed on the table without comment, as though it were simply a fact about the world that happened to be rendered in crayon. 4 figures. Tall one, small one woman with dark hair suggested rather than drawn in detail, and in the upper corner a figure surrounded by yellow marks that Leo had described to Ms. Aldrich as light. She's still in the picture. The woman with dark hair had not been drawn as anyone specific. She was the shorthand of a 6-year-old who knew what he meant without needing to fully render it. She could have been anyone. She also was not anyone. Children were not abstract about the things they were certain about. Callum looked at the drawing for a long time. Then he looked at the closed closet down the hall, which was where it had stood for 4 years, and felt the map that was gone and the question of the different map, and understood that Garrett had been right about one thing without knowing it. The question was not whether the new map would erase the first one. The question was whether he had the courage to find out that it wouldn't. He picked up his phone. He opened a new message to Claire. He typed, "Tomorrow," before the 9 o'clock. I need to tell you something about the accident. Not for sympathy, because you should know before anything else. He looked at it for 60 seconds, which was long enough for the part of his brain that had been running the avoidance protocol to file a thorough objection. Then he sent it. Her response came in 4 minutes, 1 minute longer than Friday's reply, which meant she had thought about it before answering. I'll be there at 8. Take your time. He set the phone on the kitchen table beside the drawing. The sealed room had held exactly 2 visitors in 4 years. Tomorrow it would hold a 3rd. He did not know what would happen after that. He knew it was the right direction, which was something he had not been able to say with any honesty for a long time. The clock on the microwave read 10:41. He should sleep. Leo would need him functional in the morning, and the day ahead would require more from him than most. He knew all of this in the practical way that he knew most things clearly, completely, and with limited ability to act on it at any speed the moment actually demanded. He stood in the kitchen for another minute, looking at the drawing and the phone in the hallway where the closet door was closed, and decided that the sealed room had already been cracked open by a man in a coffee shop on Clement Street, and that cracked open was different from sealed, and that different was a beginning, whether or not it felt like one yet. He went to bed. He thought about a road and a green light and a turn not yet taken. He thought about the intersection of Alderton and Connell in the late afternoon light, and the moment he had sat at the green light and seen it clearly for the first time, and the fact that he had turned away, and the fact that turning away while seeing clearly was not the same thing as turning away because you couldn't look. Tomorrow he would stop explaining why. Tonight, that was enough. The morning that followed the worst week of his professional life arrived without ceremony. No particular quality of light, no atmospheric signal that something had shifted. Just the alarm at 6, the coffee maker's complaint, and Leo appearing in the kitchen doorway with his hair at an angle that suggested his pillow had opinions. Callum had been awake for 40 minutes already. Not the anxious wakefulness of the previous nights, something quieter. The wakefulness of a man who had made a decision and was waiting to execute it rather than still turning the decision over. He had drafted the transfer request at 11 the night before after Leo was asleep, after he had stood in front of the open closet for the third time in 2 weeks and finally taken down 7 pieces of Emma's clothing and folded them into the box by the door. Not everything. He was not ready for everything. But 7 was a beginning, and beginnings did not require completion to be real. Leo ate his cereal in its established order, least favorite first best saved for last, and did not ask any large questions which felt like its own form of consideration. He had a field trip permission slip that needed signing which Callum signed, and a question about whether tortoises could be trained to respond to their names, which Callum answered honestly in the negative, while acknowledging that Professor Shellsworth might be an exception given his apparent distinction of character. Leo accepted this with the seriousness the subject deserved. At the door, backpack on, Leo turned back. "Dad," the register of his voice had dropped to the one he used for things that mattered, "whatever you're figuring out, I think you should do it." He was through the door before Callum could answer, which was probably intentional because Leo had inherited the instinct for when a thing was better said and walked away from than waited on. Callum stood in the hallway for a moment. Then he picked up his bag and went to work. He sent the transfer request to Garrett from the parking structure before he went upstairs. Clean and operational requesting movement to the Strategic Planning Division, citing professional development and alignment with restructuring priorities, framing it as forward-looking rather than reactive. He attached a brief note. "The timing is intentional. I'll explain when you have a moment." Garrett's response arrived while Callum was in the elevator. "I had a feeling. I'll handle the Margaret piece. Come see me after the 9 o'clock. You did the right thing." He took the long way. He registered making the choice which was different from the automatic pilot of previous mornings. The distinction was small and significant simultaneously. Claire was already in the small back conference room on 7 when he arrived at 8:03. She had coffee from the corner place on his side of the table, the specific order she had apparently noted at some point without announcing the noting. She was standing at the window when he came in and turned, but did not move toward or away from him, simply held the room and let him enter it at whatever pace he required. He sat. He looked at the coffee. He thought about the sealed room and Garrett's voice at Birchwood saying the question is whether you're willing to stop blaming yourself long enough to find out what's still possible. The night Emma died, his voice was level, the voice of someone who had prepared this and was now executing it past the point of retreat. We were driving back from the Berkshires, 32 weeks along with our second. We took the road instead of flying because the research on third trimester travel was inconclusive enough that Emma didn't want the risk. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. I was driving. A truck ran the light at Alderton and Connell. 42 and a 25. Hit us on the passenger side. He looked at the window instead of at her. Emma and Lily died from their injuries. Leo survived because of where he was positioned in the back seat. I walked away with a broken arm and 3 cracked ribs. Claire did not fill the silence with sound. Every investigation confirmed the same thing. I had the green light. I was at the speed limit. I did nothing wrong. The phrase had the texture of something repeated so many times it had worn smooth. But I was driving, and Emma was in the seat next to me. And I have been living with the arithmetic of those two facts for 4 years without being able to separate them into something I could hold in different hands. The room held the statement without comment. Outside in the hallway, the building was coming to life, phones and footsteps and the ordinary machinery of a workday. "Why are you telling me this?" Claire's voice was careful without being cautious, the voice of someone moving with intention rather than treading lightly. Callum turned from the window and looked at her. Not the moderated glance of the past 8 weeks, but the full direct attention he had been conserving. "Because I'm done letting it be the reason I don't try. Because you said something yesterday about your judgment and trusting it again, and I realized I've been using the same argument in a different form, that my record disqualifies me, that what happened means I owe something to staying still." He held her gaze. "And because you should know what you're contending with. Not as a warning, as honesty." She was quiet long enough that he understood she was actually thinking rather than performing consideration. When she spoke, the words had the quality of something arrived at rather than produced. "You're not the accident. You know that. Some days I know it. Then on the days you don't, that's something you carry with support, not alone. Simple, direct, not performing comfort. I'm not asking you to be finished with it. I'm saying the carrying is something you can share without it becoming a weight on the person you share it with." The 8 o'clock became 8:52, and they walked out separately, and the 9 o'clock proceeded with its operational content, and nothing about the way they occupied the conference table was different from any previous Monday. But the ground under both of them had changed in the way ground changed when something buried had finally been named. After the meeting, Garrett caught Callum in the corridor. "Margaret's looking at the transfer this morning. I framed it as the restructuring acceleration. Your move becomes part of the official reorganization rather than a standalone action." He studied Callum with the directness of a man who had been watching someone find their footing for a long time. Marcus Holt filed something with HR at 9:47. The information settled in Callum's chest with a weight that was not surprise. What did he file? Conflict of interest complaint, pattern of favoritism, supporting documentation going back 8 weeks. Garrett's voice was even. What he didn't know when he walked in there is that IT had already flagged the calendar access anomalies and building security had logged his after-hours activity. HR received his file in the context of an inquiry into his own conduct that Margaret had opened this morning. A pause. He walked into a room that was already arranged against him. He just didn't know it yet. Callum thought about Owen, who had been paying attention since before anyone had asked him to. He thought about the recording Owen had mentioned, the supply closet confrontation captured on Owen's phone because Owen had seen Marcus go in and trusted the instinct that made him document things quietly and without announcement. The planted seed from weeks ago yielding now exactly what it had been growing toward. "Is Claire in the meeting with Margaret?" "At 11. You're not needed. Your transfer documentation is sufficient. This one she handles on her own ground." Garrett held his gaze. "Let her." Callum let her. He spent the morning in the unfamiliar territory of a man who had done what he could and was now required to wait for the consequences to arrange themselves. He worked on the Henderson final analysis, which did not need him, but accepted his attention. Owen appeared at 10:15 with coffee and the expression of someone who had information and was exercising restraint about delivering it. "The HR meeting," Owen said. "Garrett told me. I mean the part Garrett might not know yet." Owen sat down on the edge of the desk with the careful precision of a person handling something fragile. Marcus walked out of HR at 10:30. Not under escort voluntarily. He looked like a man who had gone in expecting one thing and discovered the room had entirely different furniture. Owen paused. "I happened to be in the hallway." "You happened to be in the hallway." "I had a document to deliver on 3. The timing was incidental." Owen's expression was the definition of neutral. He didn't look angry when he came out. That's the part I keep thinking about. He looked like someone who had just understood something they'd been refusing to understand. At 4:23, Callum was finishing the last section of the Henderson summary when footsteps in the hallway resolved into Marcus Holt, who stopped at the entrance to Callum's cubicle with his jacket on and his hands at his sides and an expression that had nothing performed in it. The two men looked at each other. Callum did not stand and did not speak, waiting. "I'm not here to argue," Marcus said. His voice had lost the calibrated quality it had carried in every previous encounter, the prepared statement quality of a man delivering lines he had rehearsed. What was underneath it was simpler and considerably less armored. I wanted to say it directly, rather than through a process. A beat. What I did, the file, the photographs, all of it, I told myself it was about professional standards. It wasn't. He looked at Callum with the exhausted honesty of someone who had been stripped of a useful fiction. "You were right about what I was scared of. I didn't expect you to see it." Callum recognized this for what it was: not a resolution, not a conversion, just a man standing in a doorway having arrived somewhere uncomfortable and honest after a long way around. He thought about what he had said in the parking structure the previous evening, the thing he had said not to win an argument but because it was true, and truth had seemed like the only available response. "I know you're scared of being forgotten. I was too." "I know," Callum said, not warmly, not coldly, just accurate. Marcus nodded once. He left. His footsteps faded toward the elevator and then were gone, and Callum sat in the quiet of his cubicle and felt not triumph, but the particular stillness that came after something prolonged had ended without requiring a final blow. Owen appeared from around the partition 30 seconds later. "I heard none of that." "You heard all of it." "I heard none of it, and I'm very proud of how you handled it." Owen returned to his desk with the dignity of a man who had been present at something worth being present for. The 11 o'clock meeting between Claire and Margaret Ellison lasted 47 minutes, which Callum knew because he was aware of the time in the way you were aware of it when something important was happening in a room you were not in. When Claire came back onto the floor at 12:18, she walked to her office without stopping, closed the door, and was visible through the glass sitting at her desk for approximately 4 minutes before she opened her laptop and began working. She looked the way a person looked when something heavy had been set down. Not light exactly, but different in the way that different was a form of relief. He did not interrupt her. He sent one text, "Whenever you're ready." Her response came 40 minutes later. "Come to the small room. Bring the Henderson back up. We'll make it look like a working lunch." The working lunch lasted 22 minutes of actual work and the rest of something else. Margaret had accepted the transfer as part of the restructuring official clean documented as organizational development rather than reactive repositioning. Marcus's complaint had been received in the context of the existing inquiry into his conduct, which had generated enough material on its own that his file had been substantially diffused. He was on administrative leave pending formal review. "She apologized," Claire said. She was looking at the courtyard window, not at him. "Margaret, for not catching it sooner. I wasn't expecting that." A pause. "She said my record was mine. No part of it belonged to anyone else's narrative." The words had a quality of something being tested for weight and finding it accurate. "I've been telling myself that for 3 years. It's different when someone with institutional authority says it in a room." "It shouldn't be different." "No, but it is." She looked at him then. "I thought I was past the part where I needed external confirmation that my judgment worked. Apparently I wasn't quite as past it as I thought." "That's not a flaw." He met her eyes. "That's just being honest about where you actually are instead of where you want to be." Something in her face shifted, a small movement that was not performed and was not hidden. "You've gotten considerably better at honesty in the past 2 weeks." "I had good reason to." They were both quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that had changed its quality over the past several days, from the charged silence of things being withheld to the easier silence of things no longer requiring words. "Dinner," Claire said. "Not working lunch, not a conference room. Somewhere that has nothing to do with this building." She said it plainly, as she said most things. "Saturday if you're free, and I'd like to meet Leo at some point, not Saturday when he's ready. On his terms." "He has terms," Callum said. "He wants to know if you know anything about dinosaurs." Claire looked at him with the expression of someone who had just been handed an unexpected advantage. "Spinosaurus was probably a better swimmer than T-Rex. I read that somewhere and I've been waiting for it to be useful." Callum looked at her across the small conference table in the room with no cameras and the window looking onto the interior courtyard, and the thing that arrived in his chest was not dramatic and did not ask permission. Just a simple, complete recognition, the feeling of something slotting into the right place after a long time being slightly off axis. He did not say what he was thinking. The moment did not require it. She could see it anyway. "Saturday," he said. He left the building at 4:50 later than usual and drove to Jefferson Street. Leo came through the doors at a run, Spider-Man backpack airborne, and delivered an immediate briefing on Professor Shellsworth's first confirmed response to his name, which Owen had been correct in predicting would be a significant development. Callum listened and drove and felt the particular music of his son's voice filling the car with the trust of a child who had decided the world was worth narrating at length. At the Alderton Street intersection, 3 blocks from the school, Callum slowed. He had slowed here for 4 years without registering it as a choice, the reflex so deep it had become structural, a route, not a decision. Left turn on Birch, 2 blocks out of the way, back around on Connell from the other direction. 47 seconds longer on a good day. He had done it approximately 1,000 times. He had never once in those 1,000 times identified it as something he was choosing to do, rather than something he simply did. Leo was asleep in the back seat. The small, unconscious weight of a 6-year-old who had processed his day and found it satisfactory and surrendered to the particular confidence of a child who trusted the person driving to get them home. The light was green. Callum's hands were steady on the wheel. Not from effort, not from the deliberate steadying of a man overriding his body's response, but simply steady the way hands were when the thing they had been braced against had already passed. He looked at the intersection. He looked at the green light. He thought about the sealed room and the arithmetic that had lived there, and the 4 years of the long way, and Emma's voice saying, "Those are the same thing." He turned right. The intersection of Alderton and Connell looked the way intersections looked. Traffic signals, painted crosswalks, a dry cleaner on the near corner, and a pharmacy on the far one, 2 people waiting to cross with a dog who had opinions about the wait. The ordinary physical facts of a place that had for 4 years existed in his body as something else entirely. He drove through it, and the world on the other side was exactly the world he had left on the other side. Not healed, not finished. Not the triumphant crossing of a man who had solved the problem, just a man who had driven through an intersection with his sleeping son in the back seat and his hands steady on the wheel, and had found that the thing he had been carrying was still present, but was for the first time in 4 years, something he was carrying rather than something that was carrying him. He did not say anything out loud. Leo slept. The city moved around them in its ordinary afternoon indifference. 3 blocks from home, Leo stirred without fully waking and said something unintelligible that resolved into the word sharks, and then he was asleep again, chasing whatever his dreaming mind had decided was worth chasing. Callum looked at his son's face in the rearview mirror. 6 years old, a drawing with 4 figures and light in the corner. The casual, devastating confidence of a child who had kept a spot and had not once doubted it would be filled. He drove the rest of the way home on the direct route. When he parked and turned off the engine and sat in the silence of the car for a moment, what he felt was not the absence of grief. Grief was still there, would always be there, had reorganized itself over 4 years into something he carried in the same body where everything else lived. What was different was what was beside it. The possibility that had always been there, and that he had been in his exhaustion and his guilt and his thoroughly understandable inability to distinguish between honoring Emma and punishing himself for surviving her refusing to look at directly. He could look at it now. He carried Leo upstairs, which was a maneuver he had been performing since Leo weighed considerably less, and which he would not be able to do for many more years, and put him in his bed without fully waking him, and went to the kitchen and stood at the counter with the evening settling around him. On the table, Leo's latest drawing, the family diagram for class 4 figures with the light in the corner. The tall one, the small one, the dark-haired woman sketched with the minimum strokes of a child who had known what he meant without needing to fully render it. And above them in yellow crayon the suggestion of something gentle. She was still in the picture. She had always been still in the picture. The picture had simply finally made room. Callum looked at it for a long time. He did not speak to the empty room. He did not need to. The box by the door held 7 items, and the closet on the right side held the rest, and both of those things were true simultaneously, and neither one canceled the other. He picked up his phone. He opened his message to Claire and typed, "Leo wants to know about Spinosaurus. I think you should come to lunch on Saturday and tell him yourself." He looked at it. Added, "He'll have follow-up questions. Bring patience." Sent it before the version of himself that had been running the avoidance protocol could file a final objection. Her response came in 4 minutes. "I have extensive patience and moderate knowledge of the Cretaceous period. Saturday works. And Callum, thank you. For this morning. For all of it." He set the phone down on the table next to the drawing and stood in the kitchen of the apartment on Westmore Avenue and felt the ordinary quiet of an evening that asked nothing of him except to be present in it. Not ready. He had accepted somewhere in the past several days that ready was not a condition available in advance. It was what you discovered on the other side of the thing you had been postponing. He had driven through the intersection. He had said the true thing in a room that could hold it. He had sent the email and deleted the long route from the map he navigated by. None of it had required him to be finished, only to be willing. Leo's drawing sat on the table with its 4 figures and its yellow light, the evidence of a child who had been planning ahead without consulting his father, who had kept a space open with the patient certainty of someone who understood something the adults around him were still working toward. The spot was not empty anymore. The picture was complete.